This guy is a great mind on what's happening in America, and I think he was out in front of so much that is going on now, way ahead of many who are talking about it now. I mean, the loss of democracy, the rise of authoritarianism. Jared Yates Sexton, very early to that party. From his website, I like this paragraph because I think it sort of speaks to who he is. To fully understand these strange and dangerous times, Jared Yates Sexton takes a hard look at our nation's history, namely the abuses committed by those in power, the comforting stories that shape the way the West has viewed itself up to the present, as reactionaries and authoritarians cling to myths about, quote, Western civilization. We talk a lot about that on the show. The Midnight Kingdom is just one of his books. He has a regular Substack. I support all of his endeavors as best I can. I think he's a great mind. How about it for Jared Yates Sexton, everybody? Hello,
Mark,
sir.
Such a kind introduction. And meanwhile, I've got the Civilian Conservation Corps outside wielding more chainsaws than I knew existed in the world.
I was warned that we have chainsaw noise, but Tony, who's kind of a ninja when it comes to this sort of thing, says the microphones now oddly won't pick it up much of the time. But we'll try to ride herd over it. If it gets out of hand, we'll reschedule.
Here's hoping, because I've been looking forward to this conversation, and then the small army descended on my neighbor's house. So thank you as always. It's good to see you, Mark.
Yeah, it is great to see you. Look, I see this train getting to kind of runaway status, and you know how I feel. I think this coup is about complete. I see this rise of authoritarianism sort of having risen in many ways, but your takes are even sharper than that. I wonder if you can speak to it.
You know, Mark, I think one of the things is because we're living in these really unprecedented moments in our lifetimes, we have to understand it through analogies. And the idea of a train, and you know, you think about a train that, like, you watch a movie where like the brake breaks, right? And there's no ability to slow it down. And as things speed up, there's more and more of an opportunity for that train to derail. And that's what's happening right now, is all of these brakes that are supposed to be there, these institutional guardrails, they've been exposed as not just rotten and corrupted, but in many cases, non-existent. I mean, we've now seen the President of the United States of America in the modern era completely ignore the Supreme Court. Not that I even respect the legitimacy of the Supreme Court, but to see it happen and to keep watching every single day as there is one more sort of testing of the systems, and to see that they are lacking and that they're incapable. I completely agree. We are on a runaway train at this point, and it's on all of us to slow it down.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that you do on your Substack. You, I think, bring people through beat by beat what's happening. You almost break everything that's going down into sort of sectors of concern. And then, to your credit, you do point to ways in which we can do something and there might be a way out of it. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, and I appreciate you noticing that. I'm a former professor, so a lot of the ways that I try and scaffold these things is trying to make it sort of understandable and also start to build off of it. And the other issue with this is that this is so complicated and so weird and so dangerous that if we try and take it all in at once, we are going to be overwhelmed. And that is one of the main weapons of authoritarianism, is weaponized abuse and to overwhelm the individual. And I want to say to the people who are watching and listening to this, the way that you're feeling is valid, because you are in a dangerous situation that is intended to overwhelm you. So we have to pay attention to that while also breaking it down to understand where the opportunities are. And so I keep trying to explain this, which is, we're in a very dangerous time, and every day brings new horrors. But we also have to understand that there is always an equal and opposite reaction to what authoritarians do. And we're seeing that as the backlash builds, not just in terms of protest, but in terms of like sliding poll numbers. There's always authoritarian overreach in which, I don't know, they try and disappear children out of nowhere. And people feel it and they see it and they recognize that this is evil and this is wrong. So basically what we have to come to understand is what this thing is, and our own role in a small d democratic society in terms of understanding how it is that we can come together to start to effectively break this train and start to head it in a different direction, because we actually do have the power. The entire point of this onslaught is to make us feel alone and powerless, but we're not.
So when you talk about those things that are being done by this authoritarian regime, this rising authoritarian crew, and you even sort of maybe allude to the deportation of mother and child with cancer, 4-year-old child with cancer, without any accounting for medications that the child needs, et cetera. Not to mention the legality, which it really runs afoul of. Do these things then begin to pick up a kind of momentum of their own? That is to say, these heinous acts, people look at that and they kind of recoil from that. I mean, that's a rough one. You know, they can put whatever spin they want on the guy they send to El Salvador. Well, he was a wife beater, he was this, he was that. But it's hard to put a spin on a 4-year-old kid with cancer, or this child with cancer, the way they did. Do these things then ultimately, these authoritarians, fall of their own weight? Or when you say we need to do something, is it just exposing these stories to the point that there is enough momentum to block them?
Well, it's a process of dehumanization. And we've seen it take place. I mean, I try and make it very clear that Trump is a symptom of a larger disease. And, we're about 20 years out now from the war on terror, in which we saw people being randomly killed by the United States of America, but they weren't in America. Right? We saw it happen around the world on our behalf, so to speak, actually on the behalf of corporations, but we were roped into it. And so as that occurs in the periphery, we're supposed to feel differently about human life. If they label someone a terrorist, they deserve to die. If someone's a criminal, they deserve whatever happens to them. And you can't have this current state that we're dealing with, including concentration camps being built around the country, and also this bizarre corporate outsourcing of a carceral state that's been growing in this country for a while. So what happens is when you see a child with cancer being disappeared, when you see a judge being arrested at a courthouse, it's a message to the rest of us that says we can get anybody at any given time at any given moment. It's whatever we want to do. And what that does is it begins to install a dictator in our heads. There's this idea when you look at like past fascist movements or Nazi movements or whatever it is, the brain tells you that there's a gun trained on everybody, right? That at all given moments you are under the barrel of the gun and under the heel of the boot. But what happens is these examples, they're supposed to say to you, hey, you have a choice here, which is you either shut up and you allow this to happen, or else you're going to end up in El Salvador, or you stand up and say that this is wrong, and you risk ending up on a flight to CCOT or wherever wherever they've set up for us in the future. Alcatraz now, right? So while that happens, we are facing a moral and ethical crisis of the individual, which is, do we just turn away? Do we shut it off? Do we not pay attention? Do we go ahead and lie low so that we don't get violence visited upon us? Or do we listen to the moral tuning fork of the soul? And we say that this is more than enough. And eventually that will either reach a precipice where we will either back down and sort of allow this to happen because we're afraid, or we'll stand up and risk danger and violence and threats in order to say, you know what, enough is enough. We're not going to deal with this anymore, and something has to change.
I wonder about the distraction element that is built into this administration. Particularly, you have a showman as the empty vessel that is sort of the empty vessel to all these corporate interests, to the oligarchical interests that really control things. And he himself, while an empty vessel, not really aware of anything, not aware of history, not aware of geopolitics, not aware of economics, clearly, he still has these reflexive movements that then, utterances over the weekend, everybody scrambles to yes sir him and to jump on it. One of the things I worry about with all that, and just with this kind of basic disposition he has, is the adventurism that I feel he is expressing with tariffs that might also be expressed with the American military overseas. Do you see that as well?
Yeah, I do. And I think it's really helpful we have to do weird things in these situations because it's a weird situation. We both have to focus and unfocus on Trump. We have to understand the elements of Trump as an individual that makes this possible, which is that he has created a cult around himself, right? What is wrong with Trump, which is almost everything, is a reflection of what's wrong in American culture. There are a lot of people in this country who are caught in the thrall of a power self-destructive cult. That's why MAGA works, right? And what has actually happened, and you started to touch on it, which is That cult has now been bought by an oligarchical class. They paid for it in full, whether it was through billions in crypto or the couple $100 million, that Elon Musk passed him in order to get JD Vance as the VP and total control of the government. And so what happens in this is the relationship between the dictator and the oligarchical class. It's weird and it flexes. There are moments where one person has sort of more influence. There's a moment where another person, they sort of tussle for control all the time. And the hard part about it is when you have such a failure of a person like Donald Trump ahead of this thing, not only does he enjoy the religious faith of his cultist, but he is very liable at any given moment to be on a live mic and say, hey, guess what? We're going to Greenland tomorrow, right? We're going to be in Panama tomorrow. Or he might get involved in some sort of a personality conflict with, Xi Jinping. And we don't know exactly where that will lead, but it is a tenuous relationship between the dictator and the oligarchical class. And it just so happens that Donald Trump is one of the most intellectually incurious, self-dealing individuals you could ever imagine. And every time he opens his mouth, there is a possibility that this thing will get wilder and more dangerous because he's so undisciplined and also self-obsessed. So this is a weird back and forth that we see grow with every single day.
Yeah, and he likes to make news. He
Yeah.
likes pronouncements. He likes the theater of being president and of getting that attention. And so you're right, that can manifest itself in a benign way, or it can manifest itself in a really scary way. Do you see the adversarial relationship that we've now developed? We've always had an adversarial relationship with China on some level, but there's been engagement with China in ways that have been productive. Do you see the new relationship that Trump has created with China? How do you game that out? How do you see that going?
Well, it's another strange situation because we are effectively in a second Cold War at this point. And it was always going to happen as China became more and more ascendant. And we've seen that. Members of both parties have saber rattled against China, and basically among the political and the punditry class, it's basically accepted at this point that we're going to have a war with China, which is what happens when you have an empire that suddenly has a new challenger. And the American empire is in decline, and empires in decline, they get increasingly more and more desperate. But there's a weird thing that's happening here as well, which is the authoritarianism in America is not isolated. It has American characteristics, but it's also borrowing. It's almost how you see a melting pot of, these neighborhoods that start having different cultures that rub against one another. The American authoritarian sort of system that we're starting to have, it's both inherently American. It has parts of Russia. It has parts of Hungary. And they are so obsessed, and this is one of the more frightening aspects, they are so obsessed with what China has created for itself. And the surveillance state, the sort of weird capitalism, controlled capitalism parts. So effectively what's happening at this point is that America looks at China, it sees it as a threat to its hegemony, but at the same time, they sort of look at it and they say, hey, that's what we need for ourselves. So there is both the chance that at any given moment, and when these sort of empires start to break apart, things get very weird. And they start getting very turbulent. So there is the possibility that we could be at war with any of these countries at any given moment, but we're also information sharing in terms of how to build that surveillance state. And I think it's important to point out for people who are listening, the surveillance state in China was effectively partly created by the same tech oligarchs that are currently creating ours. And they've exported that technology, that information, and those strategies. So what's happening is we're becoming more like those countries while also having this weird turbulent relationship with them as America declines.
Wow. Yeah, that's so fascinating. We kind of have China envy when
Right.
it comes to so much of this, even as we are on adversarial footing. And you're right. I mean, I just saw that the big government contract goes to, is it Palantir, the Teal? It's this handful of people controlling so much worldwide. So the idea of a pushback, of institutional pushback, is, I think it dovetails with your notion, which is something that I've crowed about for a long time, and it's not even original to us, I don't think, that this myth of American exceptionalism
Yep.
has, in a way, created a complacency with
Yes.
us feeling, well, the institutions will hold up. They held up the first time. I mean, J6 was a real problem, and still, the ship of state didn't sink. And so there's this sense that we have these remarkable institutions. And I love that you speak to how weak these institutions are, because they're made up of people. They're not independent of the individuals who inhabit them.
That's right. And the institutions in the United States of America from their very beginning were decidedly and purposefully anti-democratic. The thing that we don't understand about American history, and it gets paved over whenever like all these books get banned and we start talking about a patriotic education, we don't understand that the American story is a battle between authoritarianism and democracy. And that the things that we've enjoyed and taken for granted, including protections, liberties, freedoms, all of those were hard fought and hard won. And so they do have moments where they move back and forth. So the story of America that most people have is a mythology. It has absolutely no relationship to the actual dynamics about how America has worked. And people who will say this isn't who we are, this is who we are. And it's who we've been, and it's who we've been in recent history, if you even take a look at it accurately. And so what we're talking about now is we can't become conservative. Like 2016, when Trump originally got elected, it couldn't happen if it wasn't for the war on terror. All of these executive orders couldn't happen except for the fact that the parties kept giving more and more authoritarian powers to the presidency. And this was a long, long haul, not to mention neoliberalism and one sort of consensus after another that created the oligarchical class that's now doing this. We can't just keep fighting to conserve what it is that we had before Trump, what little remains of it. We have to take a look at what wasn't working, and we have to fight for something that is not just different, but quite frankly, Mark, we deserve better than what we had before Trump. It wasn't enough. It was scraps. And at this point, if we're going to get out of this situation, and history tells us this, you have to create an alternative that actually makes people's lives better, as opposed to saying, guess what, we're better than this person. And we deserve so much more than that.
Trump is that transformational figure for the extreme right. I don't know if there's an ascendant transformational figure coming up on the other side. Do you see anyone? Maybe I'm so blinded by sort of traditional politics that it's hard for me to see who might be an ascendant figure like that.
I keep calling this a moment of clarity. Because, in the past, whatever political stances you took, you could kind of massage it a little bit. You could be like, well, I would love to be able to do that, but the money's not there. Or, yeah, if everything was perfect, we could do that. All of a sudden now, in a time of great pressure and great crisis, we're seeing who people really are. I mean, look at how Gavin Newsom has responded to this. He's like, yeah, absolutely, a terrible time. Hey, Steve Bannon, it's great to talk, right? Or, even like Gretchen Whitmer, it's like going into the Oval Office and like showing yourself hiding behind binders. Meanwhile, there are people who are now walking the walk and talking the talk. Lately, I've been very enthused about J.B. Pritzker, who seems to understand what's going on in this country. And I think the people who are revealing that they actually care about not just the state of the country, but about the individual lives of people. We can't keep making deals where we're like, yeah, you know what, I support that group, but we really, that's not going to poll well, right? That's going to cost us this state or that state. It's time to see an actual resistance that isn't just identity, like sort of, I'm a resistor, here are the memes that I share.
Right.
Like, there's skin in the game now. And people are going to have to risk the consequences of the authoritarian system you and I have been talking about. And the people who are starting to speak out are showing great courage, and great leadership comes from great courage. And so I am starting to see people who are doing that. And quite frankly, and I know your audience is part of this, you see the vast majority of the American public wants that. They desperately want something different, and they desperately want people to fight. So it's not just a courage of like staying away from, this violence or whatever. It's also about recognizing that there's a great thirst among the American populace that needs and wants and desperately craves somebody who's going to do the fighting for them.
There was a question that came up, Jarrett Yates Sexton, and it came up in the chat today. And I kind of answered it quickly because we were in a time bind, but I want to pose it to you and just explore it for a second.
Sure.
And that is, will there be another U.S. election? And this is obviously they're talking about a general election, I guess. And I said, of course there will be. There are elections in Russia, there are elections in China, there are elections everywhere. They're just like there are courthouses everywhere and judges in all of these countries also. The question is the legitimacy of those things and these institutions, including the election. I wonder if you could speak to that question.
Well, I want to say two things on that because I think that's one of the great questions of our moment. First things first is the idea of managed democracy or illiberal democracy, which is what we've seen in Russia and Hungary, especially, which is where you have a system. Some people refer to it as competitive authoritarianism, which is where you have a strong authoritarian party. They allow elections to happen, but quite frankly, nobody believes them. Right? Like you see the numbers come out and you're like, oh, great. Vladimir Putin got 97% of the vote, which that 3% is actually sort of a gift from Vladimir Putin. It's almost, like spitting in people's faces.
Right.
So I will say that is a possibility. And I say that's a possibility because I keep seeing people who are in the middle of this authoritarian crisis who keep looking for 2026, who keep looking for 2028. And what I tell people in my organizing, when I'm trying to get people to do this fight, I say, you cannot rely on those things. Like maybe they will happen. And if so, that's the cherry on top. That's the bonus. But we have to fight like every single day from one day to the next is the last day that we have to fight. And you can't rely on those things. We've already seen Trump and the people around him have started to eat away at the barriers of voting and protections and all of these things. And they've been doing it for years. So I think there's a very real possibility that we'll have elections, but I don't think that you can have faith that these things are going to be what saves us. And I think that's one of the things that's held the Democratic Party back so far. And a lot of the people who, quite frankly, should be in the streets at this point is a faith that those elections are going to go off unfettered, which I don't think you can say at this point.
I can even make the argument that the last election, he takes all the swing states. There is a lot I thought that was curious about that. And we've had Greg Palast on a couple of times. I think he's done some decent reporting on disenfranchisement of voters, and there's been real voter suppression in this country. It's been a high art in certain states, but I think it can be taken to an even more dangerous level, and likely with the Trump people in control of so much, even when it comes to states. And I think maybe, Jared, there's some high ground in that all the states run their own elections. So maybe there's a possibility of greater legitimacy that way. But I think now the MAGA world has infiltrated even those state elections, and I have great anxieties about the legitimacy of the next election.
Well, I had all these conversations after 2020, and I'm sure you remember this as well. After the 2020 election, all of these so-called red states held all these audits. They had all kinds of weird people going in and looking at the numbers and looking at the machinery, more or less. And I said, they're trying to figure out, they're not looking for fraud. They're trying to reverse engineer this thing to understand what to do with it. And I think us having this conversation, we're not having a wild-eyed conspiracy theory conversation. I'd be slamming my fist and saying, obviously this happened. But the fact that we're talking about it, it betrays something, which is we have a reason to wonder whether or not our elections are free and fair as they stand. And that should be a barometer of where we are in this situation. And I have to tell you, point blank, you look at the authoritarian right, and I've read their writing. I live and swim in this stuff, unfortunately, and they even admit that if they could do it, they would. That should be enough for us to understand that we need to have election integrity and really take big steps for this, but also have in the back of our minds that we're no longer playing a political game. We're no longer talking about electoral colleges and political strategies. We're literally talking about a group that has openly espoused how much they want to destroy democracy, and they've said as much. So the fact that we're even having this conversation, it should tell people exactly where we are on the scale at this point.
Yeah, it's such a great point that the notion that if we could, we would, and we might type thing, because they view it as they're wrestling for the soul of America. Their view is it's informed by a religiosity, isn't it? I mean, either a literal religiosity, that is to say the alt-right religious nationalism, or just a religiosity, a fervor that informs the MAGA nation.
Yeah, Mark, one of the big aha moments for me was I reread Bill Cooper's Behold the Pale Horse. And for people who don't know Bill Cooper, he was the original Alex Jones. And Behold the Pale Horse is one of the great conspiratorial books of like the 20th century. And I reread it as I was writing The Midnight Kingdom, and a passage really hit me in the chest. And he said, I know that there are conspiracies because if I was in a position of power, I would enter a conspiracy in order to keep my power. And what we're talking about here is a projection. And what we've been dealing with the right wing is a group of people who, by the way, hate themselves. That's what's happening in this. They hate the parts of themselves that have like they feel gross about. They feel like betray their principles. And what happens, and psychology tells us this, they project it on the rest of the world. And so every time they talk about these conspiracy theories, they're actually confessions about what it is that they would do. And just a quick example of this, Mark, the entire basis of the right-wing authoritarian project is they're hurting the children. We have to save the children. Look what they're doing to the children. Look what they're doing to the children. They're taking away their education. They're taking away their vaccines. And on top of that, if that's not enough, and on top of disappearing them, what are they doing? They're preparing them for labor. They are rewriting all of these laws to put children back, and they're already there, but they're wanting more of them in, slaughterhouses and factories and mines, just like they did during the Gilded Age. So what actually is occurring here is that everything that is behind their conspiracy theories, you can kind of extrapolate that that's where they're going to take things.
Sure.
And actually, it's been almost one for one. Everything the right has said that so-called deep staters and liberals are doing, they're actually doing it themselves. Indoctrination, taking away rights, talking about jailing people, sending them away. Like it's a confession and it's a projection.
Yeah, the shakedown that's gone on with the legal profession from the Trumps is an extraordinary thing. The capitulation, I think, from these legal firms is an extraordinary thing. It speaks to what you're talking about, which is the fear and sort of money comes first. These are corporate law firms, a lot of money at stake. But that's just part of what's going on. The suing of the media, one by one, picking media networks off, and then going after the courts. I mean, this is so, and I would say, isn't that the trio of things that authoritarians go for when they're trying to take over a country?
Yeah, because they're trying to warp all of these things into tools and weapons at their disposal. And they use sort of these fracture points. And we're seeing it with higher ed. We're seeing all of these universities, supposedly the bastion of liberal indoctrination. Actually, these are little corporations, right? That's what they've always been. And they have all these administrators there who are absolutely happy to do these things. We'll do a little professional wrestling match. We don't want this. Oh, we'll do this. That's fine. And we're actually seeing what happens with authoritarian capture, which is you intimidate everybody that you possibly can. You invite in as much corruption as you possibly can. It's the carrot and the stick, which is join us. We'll make you powerful. We'll make you wealthy. The stick is if you don't do this, we will sue you. We'll withhold funds or whatever it is. And what's really scary about this, Mark, is like we don't know the history of it because it's not taught in our schools. This is how every authoritarian regime has acted. What we're actually watching right now is not an aberration. This is a game plan. And it's been studied. And you can look at every major right-wing authoritarian movement, and this is exactly how they operate until they capture all of those institutions. And then the moment that they capture them, they're all tools and they're all weapons.
Yeah. So it's the playbook. It's absolutely the playbook. And so I was encouraged to see that a handful of law firms were bound together to fight back and push back on the Trump attack on the law and law firms. I feel like in the collective, Jared Yates Sexton, there is more power than there is with these individual institutions trying to punch back.
Yeah, and what we're talking about here is solidarity. And one of the lessons I hope people walk away from this learning or understanding is this. When you are, as a collective, facing the authoritarian threat, you can defeat it. These people are weak. And what do we see every time somebody stands up against them? Eventually they fold because actually authoritarianism is acting out of weakness. But what happens is a divide and conquer strategy. Every single individual link in the chain of the institutions that we're talking about, they have to stand firm. And what I just talked about a while ago about that fear of whether or not you're going to get involved or whether or not you're going to stand back, everybody has to make that choice within themselves. And and law firms are part of it. Workplaces are another part. People have to stand with each other and not betray one another, which is what this culture has taught us to do. Look out for number one, take care of yourself, don't trust anybody. This is a sociopathic culture. We have to learn how to trust one another and engage in not just solidarity, but intimacy. We have to unlearn the authoritarian impulses that laid the groundwork for this thing, or else it's the old idea. We either, we all stand together or we all hang separately. And that's more or less what we're facing right now.
Although, Jared, it's remarkable to me how the divisions within America have been exposed, and perhaps the divisiveness is more divisive than ever.
Yeah, I think two things are happening there, because I'm doing a lot of work, this organizing and sort of bringing things together. And Mark, the wild thing about it, that division is actually a veneer. If you actually dig down underneath all of these sort of like conspiracy theories and cultural divides, which, by the way, are all paid for by wealth class boosted institutes, think tanks, they're the ones who create sort of the divisive issues of the time. If you actually drill down, there is a huge consensus in this country. Take an issue like abortion, which is like one of the more divisive things of our culture. Roughly 75 to 80% of Americans agree on this issue. It's just diverted by the way that it's framed. So once you start realizing that this type of stuff, the funding of education, the opposition to people like Elon Musk and the oligarchs, this entire situation, the majority of people agree. It's simply about moving beyond those storylines that have been created by the wealthy. And once you get past that, you realize we're actually like historically unified. It's just when you start talking, when you start coming together, you realize that you have power together, as opposed to the idea that we're completely separate at this point.
That's fascinating. That really is fascinating. All right, last thing.
Yep.
Relates to an op-ed I was reading from, I think, Kamala Harris's #2 guy who wrote an op-ed for the New York Times. And it was pretty good. It's kind of ironic that it was in the New York Times, because it was sort of about how the messaging in politics now can't exist in the world of the New York Times, the Washington Post, traditional mainstream media. It has to, the messaging from, of course, he's concerned with Democrats, has to now get out into other ways to get messages across. The messaging itself has to be chosen carefully, and then how the message is communicated, that has to be done in ways that are far different than the old school media. I know you feel strongly about this, and I wonder if you could speak about it.
Yeah, I think this is one of the more important things that we realize. First things first, what is the New York Times? What's the Washington Post? What are they concerned with, Mark? They are concerned with keeping things the way that they are, and maybe allowing a little bit of authoritarianism, if it helps the market. That's the big giant thing here. And what do we keep seeing? They blame the quote unquote left the same way that they blame the right, and then they end up normalizing the right. It's a game that they continually play. The Democratic Party cannot continue to go down that path. They can't continue to means test. They can't continue to rely on all of these tried and true pollsters. By the way, James Carville should be ashamed of himself.
Agreed.
As people are being thrown in prison, as people are being erased, he says, oh, we should take this out and wait for a better opportunity. No. You need to understand at this point, and this might sound extreme, but I don't think it is at all. This administration has broken so many laws at this point and has committed so many crimes against humanity that if somebody wants to run for office, these people need to be held accountable for those crimes. And on top of that, what does everybody hate? Everybody hates oligarchs hoarding resources and wealth and taking over the government. You have to speak out against that. You can't continue to use these people as donors and funders and be afraid of making them terrified and taking your base for granted. The Democratic Party has to give up on this idea that they have to become more like the Republican Party, and they need to start just telling the truth. They need to just call this what it is and start offering solutions. And that's not what I'm hearing from a lot of political leaders at this point, because those solutions terrify people like the New York Times and the Washington Post and the moderates and the billionaires who fund all of this. So start talking to people, start talking about class differences, exploitation, and give them a vision for a better future. That's what people want at this point. This isn't just a crisis of democracy. It's a crisis of faith and hope and direction. And if they could give something else, like they would reap the benefits.
Well, witness the crowds that turned out for Bernie and AOC.
That's right.
I mean, it's pretty incredible. Jared Yates Sexton, as I said, the Substack, you must subscribe, as I do, support him in all of his endeavors. And you have 3 books, I think, don't you? I want to say, there it is, Dispatches from a Collapsing State, That's Jared Yates Sexton. And the website is, what is the website? Jared Yates, tell me, Jared. Oh,
Jared Yates,
Yeah.
JaredYatesSexton.substack.com. That's where you can find it.
And there it is, the Midnight Kingdom, and his works. I don't know. I think you write so well, you communicate so well. I won't embarrass you by flattering you further, but I will just say it's a delight always to read your stuff, and even a greater delight to talk to you. So thanks for coming through.
Mark, you are so kind, and I really appreciate you being in this fight.
All the best, my friend. Jared Yates Sexton, everybody. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.